Welcome back to our podcast. As I said from from our introduction video, we'll be trying to get politicians into our podcast, and today we have another politician as well, Matt Thistlethwaite. So thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, and great initiative, guys, of encouraging younger people to understand how politics works in our community. I congratulate you for doing it.
So as myself, Francis is in this podcast, and so is George. Tobias couldn't make it today as he's on holiday, but I'm wishing Tobias a really good holiday as well. So Matt, could you just give us a little bit of a brief explanation about yourself? So what are your Australian ministry roles, and a little bit about yourself as well?
Yeah, great. I'm the member for Kingsford Smith, and I've been in this position since 2013. The seat of Kingsford Smith runs from Clovelly in the north all the way down to La Perouse, and from the ocean out to the airport. So anyone that lives within that community, I have the great privilege of representing. I've got a degree in economics and law, and I studied at the University of New South Wales in our community. I've worked as a lawyer. I've worked as a trade union official and a Labor Party official. And I'm fortunate to have the shadow portfolio of financial services and an Australian Republic. So trying to work with the Australian people about having one of our own as our head of state one day. So that's the work that I do in the Parliament, as well as representing the great community of Kingsford Smith.
Great. So we'll get started with the questions now. George, I think you have the first question to ask Matt, if you could as well ask the question.
Yeah, I have the first question. So my question is, do you support what the government has stated in the budget?
Well, the government's budget is aimed at obviously ensuring that Australia gets through the coronavirus pandemic. There's two issues to that. Firstly, there's a health issue, managing the health of everyone and ensuring that Australians reduce the amount of infection in our community. And then there's the economic arguments as well. And the budget mainly dealt with some of the economic issues. Of course, Australia was in recession. It's the first recession that we've had in close to 30 years. And that's meant that a lot of Australians are out of work. Or have been stood down. So many of the budget measures were aimed at ensuring that people got through this difficult period whilst there was a downturn in our economy. And Labor suggested a lot of those policies, like the JobKeeper policy, like an increase to the JobSeeker allowance. And it's great that the government adopted those. So we do support those elements. There are areas where we have a difference of opinion with the government. We believe that they may be withdrawing those and tapering down that support too quickly. And with this latest outbreak in Sydney, that may be the case if it goes on for some months now. That support is scheduled to be withdrawn at the end of March next year. We certainly know that the economy won't be back up and running again as it was pre-COVID by then. So there's still going to be a lot of Australians out of work that are going to need support. So we think that the government should look at extending some of that support. But also, we believe that the government needs to start looking at investing in Australians to improve the productivity of our nation. So looking at things like childcare. And the Labor Party has the opportunity to respond to the budget. It's known as the budget reply speech. And that happens on the Thursday after the budget is released on the Tuesday. And in this year's budget reply speech, the Labor leader, Anthony Albanese, outlined three big policies. One is to reduce the cost of childcare for working families so that more women in particular can get back into the workforce or training so that they're improving their personal circumstances, but also the productivity of the nation is improving. Secondly, boosting manufacturing so that we're building a lot more components, supply chain materials and finished products here in Australia, particularly in heavy engineering like train manufacturing and the like. And the third element is boosting renewable energy. There's a fantastic opportunity that Australia has to become a renewable energy superpower because of the abundance of sunlight and wind in our country. And we don't believe that the current government is taking that opportunity. So there's three areas where we differ from the government and we would have done things differently.
Yeah, those are some great points as well. I think when the government got released, when the budget got released, actually, a lot of people were saying it wasn't really helping women, I believe, and it wasn't. I think and there was also another group it wasn't really helping as well. So I think Scott Morrison, like, to try and combat that, what he did was he sent all the women in the ministry out to all the reporters saying and telling them it's not sexist or anything like that, and it's helping all Australians. So yeah, that's a really good point as well. And also for the second part there as well, with the renewable energies, I know some people in your party as well. I think Joel Fitzgibbons, he's a little bit more against that as well, because I think his electorate is a lot more based on refineries and stuff. So a lot of the people who live in his electorate work in like coal refineries and stuff. And I think he believes that for him to help his people in his electorate, the Labor Party, I think he said the Labor Party needs to go back to the centre and start thinking about helping the people who work in like the coal refineries and these parts, because he thinks that they're going too much to the left side as well.
Yeah, Joel represents an area of the Hunter Valley where there are quite a few coal mines, but there's no real difference between Joel and the Labor Party. What we're saying that the government should commit to is net zero emissions for our country by 2050. Many other nations throughout the world, and indeed every state and territory in Australia, has already done that. When you do that, then we can work on a plan with the states and territories about how we get there, how we gradually taper down the amount of fossil fuels that we use to produce energy, and how we increase the amount of renewables energy that we create, at the same time as avoiding job losses and creating jobs in new industries. So that's the real challenge for Australia. But unfortunately, the Morrison government won't adopt that long-term target. So they don't have a plan. And that's the problem. And that's the problem that Joel and others have been pointing out. The government doesn't have a plan to get us there. And you need a plan with milestones along the way. And that's what Labor's committed to. And that's why we'll work to boost renewable energy over a period of time through a smooth transition.
Yeah. So we'll get on to the next question now. George, I think you have the next question. So this also leads a little bit within the budget as well. So yeah.
Yeah, so my next question is, if you were in the government, what would be the area you would focus on to recover the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, as I mentioned in my previous answer, Labor is focusing on three things: reducing the cost of childcare, and we'll do this by removing the cap that exists at the moment on the childcare subsidy, and boosting the amount of subsidy, particularly for low to middle income earners. So this is to ensure that people who are perhaps have a disincentive to work a third or fourth day and only have their kids in childcare for 1 or 2 days a week, that ensures that they're not earning the income potential that they have, but also it holds the nation back. Because as you mentioned earlier, Francis, one of the problems with COVID is that it's disproportionately affected women in their employment situation. And that's meant a loss of income, a loss of jobs, because they're predominantly employed as part-time, as casuals. And when you have a downturn, they're the first groups of people that are put off. So we want to make sure that as a policy, as a nation, we're encouraging more families to take the opportunity to work by providing greater access to childcare. So that's one area. Secondly, I mentioned manufacturing. We should be able to manufacture trains in Australia. We should be able to manufacture high-tech goods, but we don't have a plan to do that. And a lot of that is imported into this country when the capacity and the skills exist here in Australia. So there's two elements to it: ensuring that people are well trained and have the opportunity for education in those trades. And that involves a strong TAFE sector and support for vocational training, and offering apprenticeships for people as well. And secondly, providing the government incentives to ensure that those goods are manufactured here. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, renewable energy, using the opportunity that Australia has with our comparative advantage in renewables to produce more renewable energy, to create jobs in the future. And I can give you a classic example of that. The University of New South Wales, which is in our community up the road, it's the world leading research facility for solar and photovoltaic cells. And if you go to the University of New South Wales, you see literally hundreds of people who are working on new and innovative ways to increase the amount of energy that we can get from sunlight through conversion, through those solar cells conversions. And this is creating jobs for people in our community. They're high skilled, high paid jobs. There are opportunities like that throughout Australia, and we need to take those into the future.
Yeah, just to touch on your second point as well, with the COVID-19 pandemic now, as a lot of our as a lot of things that we import into the country are from China, and seeing that we're in lockdown and the import rate from other countries is much lower. This has really showed that many like big brands as well, they're not getting as much stock as they did before, because a lot of the stuff they imported was from China and stuff, and there's been a less amount of stock as well in those stores. So yeah, that's a really good point as well.
That's right.
So we'll go on to the third question now. George, this also relates to the export and import rate. So George, would you like to say the third question?
Yes. My next question is: do you think the current government should increase the export and import rate that was decreased due to the virus?
So the virus has shown that when you have a pandemic such as this and supply chains are interrupted, that there can be vulnerabilities around things like the production of personal protective equipment like masks and screens and the like. So it's important that we do develop a capacity to produce these materials here in Australia. However, Australia is an open economy, which means that we trade with other nations where it's in our best interest. And Australia has a number of trade agreements with other countries, but we also produce a lot of goods for other countries that they can then import raw materials from us and turn into produced goods. So a lot of those are resources like coal, iron ore, gas and the like, which are big income earners for our country. And that's a comparative advantage that we have because there's an abundance of those resources here in our nation. We're also very good at producing high-tech and innovative new developments as well, particularly in the fintech space and also across the tech sector more broadly. We're a very big service-based economy, so we have an expertise in producing good services, particularly health services, education services, as well as legal, administrative and accounting services. So these are all the big dollar earners, for, if you like, for our economy and that provide jobs for people. But at the same time, we tend to buy goods that can be produced more cheaply in other jurisdictions, things like furniture, televisions, other equipment such as that, because those nations have a comparative advantage in producing those goods. So it's a matter of balancing what's in Australia's best interests and ensuring that we have stable supply chains where we need them, but also ensuring that we use the notion of comparative advantage to our advantage so that Australians can access cheaper goods from overseas where they're available and also sell our goods on international markets. So that's known as an open economy and an open trading system. And it's very important that we don't put in place barriers to that, which could harm that trading relationship and ensure that Australians end up paying more for goods and services and jobs are reduced and the economy ultimately shrinks.
There's some great points as well. So I will go on to the next question as well. So I'll be asking this question. Do you think the current government is doing a good job with dealing with the virus? Why or why not?
Well, Labor's chosen to be cooperative and constructive with the government because this is a health issue. It's beyond politics, and we want to make sure that the health of Australians comes first. There's a few points about Australia's current response that have meant that relatively we've performed well as a nation. And the first one is that we've listened to the experts. So we've listened to epidemiologists and health professionals who work in this space about what was required to reduce the rate of infection across Australia. And generally speaking, that's been tough. It's involved lockdowns, it's involved reduced access and restrictions on people's liberties, but it has worked. And we're seeing that again in Sydney at the moment, unfortunately. The second point is that the success that Australia has doesn't belong to the government, it doesn't belong to the Prime Minister or any one politician, it belongs to the Australian people because they've made the sacrifices to give up some of their freedoms to ensure the greater good. And I think that the Australian people deserve credit for that. And the final point is that it highlights the importance of a very good and properly funded public healthcare system. In Australia, that's principally the Medicare system, which means that we have universal access to healthcare. In other words, if you or I or anyone else in Australia gets sick, you can go to a doctor and use your Medicare card to get that primary healthcare and other services if they're required later on. And I think that system and that policy that we've had in place that's now part of Australian culture has served us well. So they're the three big factors that's meant that Australia's performed relatively well.
Yeah, just touch on your last point there, because in a lot of the other countries, such as like America and like European countries, a lot of them don't have a lot of them. It's very hard for like public healthcare as there's so many people there and there's not enough spots in hospitals. So as you can see in like America and stuff, there's a lot of people who can't get the hospital treatment that we can because our public health system is a lot better than those countries. And I think as well, when I think Gough Whitlam created Medicare during the 70s, when that did happen, I think America tried to copy our system. I think I thought it was called it was like Medi Health or something like that they created. Then they tried to copy our system. So that does show like our public health system is really, really good compared to a lot of other countries in the world.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Francis. If you compare it to the American system, which is a user-pays system, in other words, if you want to access particularly secondary healthcare services like hospital and other allied health services, you need to pay for them. And a lot of Americans are required to have insurance. And it's meant that quite a large proportion of the population simply can't afford it. And they don't have health insurance. And that restricts access to their system. But the great shame about their system, and we're seeing that at the moment, is that it can become overwhelmed and that it actually costs more to administer than the Australian system. It costs their budget, their government budget, more money to run their healthcare system as a proportion of their GDP than it does in Australia because we get universal access. And if someone gets sick, they can get that access straight away. So the problem doesn't get worse and worse and worse. And then you need a hospital admission, which is much more expensive. So our system is much better.
Yeah. So we'll get on to the next question as well. Do you think the federal government should have backed down on the COVID inquiry, knowing that it would destroy our trading partnership with China and therefore could destroy our economy?
Well, you can still stand for your values. And those values in Australia are democracy, transparency, freedom of speech, and the rule of law. And they're core Australian values that are fundamental to our system of government and our culture. And you can stand for those values and still manage a good trading relationship with China. So the Labor Party supported the government's call for an inquiry into how COVID started so that we could ensure that it doesn't happen again and that the world can get on top of the virus as quickly as possible and get back to normal. Australia has had difficulties with our trading relationship before COVID started. And that's a problem that this government has not been able to solve, unfortunately. And it's now becoming a big issue for our economy. We're seeing that coal, our second largest export earner, is now blocked in China. And that's going to mean that there will be a reduced income for Australia and ultimately job losses, unfortunately, if the government can't fix it. That comes on the back of barley, wheat, beef and wine exports, which have all been stopped now as well. And that's going to mean that a big market for our goods, the Chinese market, is no longer there for us and will make it harder for those producers to sell their product on international markets and could ultimately reduce their income and the jobs that they have. And that's a big issue. And I think that that's something that the government really does need to try and sort out with China as quickly as possible.
Oh, do you think with that as well, do you think Australia should try and find other trading markets such as other Asian nations like India, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia?
You should always be trying to find other markets for your products. And that's definitely the case here. The problem is that the Chinese market is so big. You're talking 1.3 billion people. And the great phenomena in China over the last 20 years has been that literally hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty and into what we call the middle classes, where they're in higher paying jobs, they're living in better accommodation, they have access to transport and access to services like healthcare, education, tourism, and the like. So there's a massive middle class in China that simply eclipses all of those other nations by huge factors. So India still doesn't have the same, anywhere near the same size middle class, nor does Indonesia as China. So that Chinese market was very lucrative for Australia because Chinese people were earning more income, and as they earned more income, they were spending it on particularly greater services like education. So a lot of them were sending their kids to university or training here in Australia, on healthcare services, particularly aged care services and better healthcare services. So wellness products like vitamins and the like were a very big export from Australia. Baby milk, baby formula products, as well as some luxury products, if you like a good Australian wine, quality Australian beef, and those sort of things. And because these restrictions have been put in place, that huge market is lost to Australia at the moment, and it's going to affect our economy.
Yeah, so we'll now get on to the last question. This is another one which is relating to China and the economy as well. Do you believe the federal government's actions on China will hurt our economy in the long run? How or why won't it? Explain.
Hopefully this can be solved rather quickly. We have had trade disputes with China in the past, and it's meant that the ministers have had to sort these issues out with China. And this happens quite regularly with other nations as well. We've had them with the United States, with European nations and other nations as well. That's why there is a World Trade Organization. And the government's taking action in the World Trade Organization to try and sort some of these issues out. But there's two things that the government can do, which we think that they should do, and that's to stop some of their backbench MPs basically saying whatever they like about China and Chinese people and potentially damaging the relationship. And the example of that is Eric Abetz asking an Australian-born person of Chinese origin to swear allegiance to Australia before they appeared before a committee, which didn't play well in many in the Chinese community in Australia. And secondly, try and use some of the existing relationships, strong relationships that Australian people have with Chinese people, particularly in the business community or the former diplomatic community, to break down some of the barriers that exist at the moment and get a dialogue going between Australian ministers and Chinese ministers about sorting out some of these issues.
Just to touch on that last point there as well. I believe David Littleproud, the agriculture minister, has said that he's lost contact with his counterpart in China for the past several months, and he hasn't had any contact with him at all. Do you think that's what do you think of that as well?
Yeah, that's a problem. When a minister doesn't have a contact that they know and trust and have a relationship with to call and try and sort through some of these issues, that's a big problem. And that has existed pre-COVID. And that's why we're saying that this government is mishandling the relationship with China, because they haven't been able to use those diplomatic channels to sort out these issues. And in the past, Australia's been able to stand for our values and maintain a strong trading relationship with China. And the example of that is the Hawke government, in the wake of the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, took a very large number of Chinese refugees. We condemned what occurred by the Chinese government with that. But Bob Hawke and his government still maintained a very strong trading relationship with China, and there were no restrictions on the trade at that time. So you can stand for Australian values of democracy, freedom of speech, and the right to protest at the same time as maintaining that relationship, and that's where this government has failed.
Yeah, those are some great points as well. So those are all. That's the end of all our questions. I would like to thank Matt for taking the time to come on the Zoom call with us and record this interview and answer the questions.
My pleasure, guys, and fantastic to see that you're doing this, and your passion and interest for politics is quite inspiring. So keep up the great work. Have a great Christmas, everyone, and I look forward to working with you in 2021.
Thank you, everyone, for watching the podcast. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you guys in the next interview.
Yeah, see you guys.